I've seen people before me work till they almost died. And I wanted to be able to retire and just have a little bit of enjoyment. If it wasn't for this food pantry, I would be in sad shape.
I've never used the food banks before. I didn't have to. I felt, I leave it for people that needed it more, but now I really almost have to come. I mean, it's changed very fast.
As war, rising fuel prices, climate change, and the aftershocks of a pandemic threaten global food supplies and lead to price hikes, the U.S. faces its own food security crisis. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, more than 1 in 10 U.S. households are food insecure. Other data shows that 1 in 8 Americans experience food insecurity. The problem was made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic and rising inflation, which soared to a 40-year high of 8.5% in March. Today, as many as 12 million children in the United States face hunger. In 2020, the Feeding America network distributed more than 6.6 billion meals through food banks across the U.S. That was before the Ukraine crisis disrupted the global supply of wheat and before the U.S. experienced the worst drought in over a decade to hit its grain-producing region. The U.S. is ranked third in production volume of wheat behind China and India. It is ranked first in crop export volume, with almost 50% of its total wheat production exported. Last month, the USDA projected a 21% drop in the country's wheat production compared to 2021, after 40% of the wheat in America's parched plains was deemed in poor or very poor condition. The drop in wheat production has led to higher consumer prices for cereals and other basic foods.
So as food prices are higher, as more people are in need of our services, we're seeing decreases in some places that are really impacting us too, like decreased donations. A majority of our members are seeing a decrease in donations. Decrease in government-supplied commodities at a time when we need it the most.
So how is the U.S. addressing its food security problem? Joining me now is Craig Gundersen, the Snee Family Endowed Chair at the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. He joins me from Texas. Craig Gundersen, how would you describe food insecurity in the United States today? Is there a food crisis?
So food insecurity is defined as when individuals do not have and households do not have enough food to eat at some point over the previous year. So this is what we mean by food insecurity. And there's been a food insecurity crisis, for decades in the United States, and it's gained a lot more attention over the past 10 years. But currently, approximately 40 million Americans are food insecure in our country.
While so many Americans are food insecure, as you say, 1 in 8 Americans are experiencing food insecurity. In other words, don't have enough food to eat on a daily basis, struggle to feed themselves, while at least $200 billion is spent on food that will never be eaten. How do you explain that nearly 40% of food produced, processed, and transported in the United States goes to waste rather than being redirected to feed those who are left hungry?
So the way I usually frame the discussion about food insecurity in the United States is that vulnerable households don't have the resources in order to access enough food. So in thinking about the approach that we use to this are issues pertaining to make sure they have enough resources. And in particular, the most critical component of that is a Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, formerly known as the Food Stamp Program. While food loss issues are important in some contexts, there's not really a direct connection between food loss and food waste issues and food insecurity, at least in the United States.
And given the situation, what is the government, the federal government, doing about it? What is Congress doing about it? Not just as a side effect of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, or climate change, but as a systemic problem that needs to be addressed.
So in terms of alleviating food insecurity, over the past 5 years, there's been a lot of really neat things that have been done in order to help alleviate food insecurity. So at the outset of COVID, for example, is that the Trump administration bumped everybody's benefits from SNAP up to the maximum level, which allowed people then to, those who were receiving SNAP, to get onto to get more benefits to purchase more food. They also made it easier to enroll in the program. And under the Biden administration then is that in this past September is that the Thrifty Food Plan, which is used to set the maximum benefit levels for SNAP, that was increased by 20%, which was also a fantastic way to address these issues of food insecurity. So over the past 5 years, those are examples of things that the US has really done to help address food insecurity in our country.
This is affecting 10 million children in the United States. As many as 1 in 6 children go to bed hungry every day. Free school meals were a lifeline for so many families, but yet today there's a real chance that these programs won't be extended. What's the responsibility of lawmakers to keep these programs in place, especially at a time like this?
So is right. So about 1 in 6 children at some point in the previous year, their household did not have enough food for them to eat. Absolutely. And one of the things that we see is that over the summer months, that there is an increase in food insecurity when children can no longer get the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program. So there's a lot of really neat initiatives that have been done to try to address this that began in 2019. For example, there was the pandemic. One example is something called the Pandemic EBT program, which allowed for SNAP benefits to be given to children whose families weren't otherwise eligible for SNAP. Another neat program is one that's run by the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty called the Meals to You program, where boxes of food are shipped to children to children over the summertime so they can have enough food. And this has been shown to be particularly effective in rural areas.
But this isn't about food scarcity. The US is the world's top food exporter. Should there be more corporate and government accountability? I mean, whose ultimate responsibility is it to address food shortages, the private sector or the government?
So the good news is in the United States is we don't have food shortages. I mean, the good news is, I mean, what I always tell people about COVID, one of the amazing things was during COVID is that despite this global pandemic, our food shelves were filled, and with some minor exceptions, and food prices didn't rise. And that really was.
But more than 10% of the population is still struggling to feed itself.
Right, but it's not due to food shortages. It's not due to food shortages. Rather, it's due to their inability to have the resources in order to purchase enough food. In other words, it's a demand side issue, not a supply side issue. And so I guess I would point to, we already know that corporate America is doing so much to help alleviate food insecurity insofar as they're keeping food prices low as possible. And, you know, they really maintain an excellent ag supply chain during the COVID era. So in other words, I do think the corporate sector is doing a lot to help alleviate food insecurity in our country.
But should there be more safeguards, more regulations, better implementation of the rules and the policies, the legislations that already exist?
So there is a fairly well-developed set of regulations. And in fact, to some extent, these regulations impede the ability for Americans to get safe, affordable, and nutritious food. So I guess I would say is we definitely do not need more regulations. What I do think, though, we need is a higher sense about, what can we do to make sure that people have the resources to purchase enough food. And the one thing that I always point to is SNAP. It really is a great program in helping alleviate food insecurity in our country.
And how do you explain the fact that many people who have not traditionally faced hunger are now having to line up to get food from food banks across the US?
Right. So what we saw during COVID was the fact that, there's 4 main reasons why food insecurity rates didn't increase during COVID. One of them is our vibrant ag supply chain. A second reason is that Americans generously donated to food banks, and so therefore there was a sharp, lot more food available to be distributed to food banks. We didn't see a huge difference in the patterns of those going to food banks during COVID or at other times. The vast majority of people going to food banks are those who are struggling because their incomes are too low to purchase enough food, or they face other impediments to do this. So things didn't change too much in terms of who was going to food banks over during COVID. That said, there are still a lot of Americans who do have to go to food banks because they don't qualify for SNAP, or they face a temporary downturn in their incomes. So yes, these food banks do play an incredibly important role in helping alleviate food insecurity in our country, both for those who are low income, but also as needed, those who are more middle income.
Craig Gundersen, Chair of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. Thank you very much for being with me.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, as is the case with many aspects of their daily lives, minorities in the United States are more vulnerable to food insecurity than white Americans. Black households in the U.S. experience food insecurity at more than 3 times the rate of white households. Access to food and proper nutrition in Black communities is a serious issue. The term food deserts has long been applied to low-income urban and rural areas where grocery stores are not readily accessible to populations that also struggle with income inequality and lack of access to transportation. The consequences are dire. A 2020 study by the Brookings Institution put it bluntly. Children born into food-insecure households risk birth defects, and children living in food-insecure households tend to have a lower health-related quality of life, higher rates of asthma, less nutritious diets, anemia, and cognitive and behavioral problems that affect well-being and school performance. Joining me now is Leah Penniman, who runs Soul Fire Farm, a nonprofit organic farm in Grafton, New York. She's the author of the book Farming While Black. Leah Penniman, in your book, Farming While Black, you focus on what you call food justice, food sovereignty. One of the terms you've used to describe the situation facing communities of color, especially Black Americans, is food apartheid. Explain why.
So food apartheid is an unnatural system of segregation that relegates certain communities to food scarcity and others to food opulence. It's no accident of history that your zip code is the leading determiner of your life expectancy in the United States, and that if you're Black, Brown, Indigenous, Latina, you're much more likely to live in a neighborhood without a supermarket, a farmer's market, and as a result of the lack of access to fresh, ancestral, nourishing food, much more likely to suffer from diet-related illness like kidney failure, heart disease, and mental illness. So it is imperative that we address this systemic and structural racism so that everybody can have access to the fresh, healthy foods that help us to thrive.
And we hear about food deserts. Tell us a little bit more about food deserts and what that means, and the fact that it exists pretty much everywhere in the United States, including here in Washington, D.C.
Absolutely. So my mentor, Karen Washington of Rise and Root Farm, encourages us to talk about food apartheid rather than a food desert, because a food desert, as defined by the government, is of course a neighborhood that's both high poverty and does not have grocery stores or other fresh food outlets. But using the term desert implies that it's a natural phenomenon, not a human-created phenomenon, and there is nothing inevitable or natural about that system. One of the ways that we need to address food deserts, food apartheid, is by investing in communities that have historically been marginalized through redlining, housing discrimination, divestment, urban blight, and other forms of structural racism. So that means getting fresh food into these neighborhoods. One salient example in our own community, Soul Fire Farm was born in the south end of Albany, which is a food apartheid neighborhood, historically redlined, and neighbors banded together to turn an old McDonald's into a community-owned grocery store with affordable fresh food. And it's one of the outlets where Soul Fire Farm delivers on a weekly basis.
You talk about structural racism, and I know much of your work has focused on the issue of injustice in the food system. How does the current agricultural system reinforce racial inequality, and how central is food security and food sovereignty to the fight for racial justice here in America?
It's such an important question, because a lot of times when we think about food and land, we don't think about race. But structural injustice permeates the food system everywhere from sunshine to plate, as my daughter would say. Let's look at land, for example. According to the US Department of Agriculture 2017 census, about 98% of the agricultural land by value is white owned in this country, which is a hugely disproportionate ownership share. And we can look historically at everything from the attempted genocide of Native people to the disintegration of 40 acres and a mule and any attempt at reparative justice after the end of chattel slavery, to the USDA themselves discriminating against Black farmers, leading to generations of foreclosures. and many other historical examples that led to this concentration of land. If we look at labor, another aspect of the food system, approximately 85% of the labor in this country is done by people of color on farms. Yet only about 2% of farms are managed by communities of color. And so there's a huge disparity in terms of who's doing the labor and who makes the decisions. And of course, we've talked about food and disproportionate access to food depending on the color of your skin, income, and your zip code. So no matter where you look in the food system, there is inequity. And the reason it is imperative to address this is because we as a nation purport to believe that everyone has the right to life, to liberty, to happiness. And there is no way to achieve this without having food in our bellies, nourishing food in our bellies. And there's no way to achieve this without having equal access to land and to capital in order to start our own businesses and to have a say in the food system.
And as you say, and as you've written extensively, this isn't by accident. It's by design, you say. It's as a result of, quote, colonial genocide, land grabbing, U.S. Department of Agriculture discrimination. You also talk about state-level nativism, lynching, expulsion, all of this leading to the fact that less than 2% of farms are owned or controlled by Black Americans. In 2022, ironically, in 1920, you say that figure was 14%. It sounds counterintuitive that we are actually going backwards when it comes to Blacks owning farms in America.
Absolutely. And folks would believe that this is because Black people chose to leave farms behind, when in fact, it's quite the opposite. You mentioned in the early 1900s was the peak of Black land ownership at 16 million acres or 14% of the nation's farms. And there has been a steady decline. And one of the push factors for that was actually racial violence. It was seen as such a threat to the white supremacist status quo in the South to have Black independent business owners that Black people were targeted by mobs, by lynching, by the Klan, the White Caps, the White Citizens Council. There are over 4,000 documented cases of these targeted murders and many more that went undocumented. And that became a major factor for the Great Migration when 6 million Black people moved from the rural South to the urban North and West trying to escape this violence. Of course, the violence took new forms in the urban North in terms of redlining and housing discrimination and also challenges owning businesses and property. But it's important to recognize that so much farmland was lost during this Great Migration and actually just absorbed into the holdings of white neighbors, often those who had perpetrated this violence.
And as you mentioned earlier, the bulk of the work done on farms is done by mostly Spanish-speaking people, immigrants with brown skin. But whether it's Black farm workers or Latinos or Native Americans, the means of production are out of their control. How do you empower them to become more food secure, given the reality of the system?
Absolutely. I think it's important to recognize that starting in the 1930s, when as a nation, we put forth the very first national labor laws, starting things like Social Security, the 8-hour workday, child labor protections, the right to a day off and 7 overtime pay. But there were exclusions in these laws, and these exclusions were specifically for farm workers and domestic workers who were Black and brown. And those exclusions continue to this day. The Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act exclude the people who arguably do some of the most important work in this country, which is to feed the nation. And we advocate for folks to take a close look at the Fairness for Farm Workers Act, which would at least equalize some of those labor issues. And we know that the best way to achieve food security is to have income stability and to be have an opportunity to rise out of poverty. So having fair wages and fair working conditions is a first step, but we want to see that go even further. We want to see the people who work the land being co-owners and managers and decision makers in the food system in this country. And that means co-ops and land trust and business owning opportunities. It also means pathways to citizenship and fair immigration laws for those who are doing this sacred and important work of feeding our communities.
When you look at the level of food insecurity rates for communities of color and indigenous communities in the US, which are far higher than the national average, when you look at the impact the pandemic has had on them, how far can community-based organizations go in helping those most affected and vulnerable? Or is it going to be down to having new legislation, new policies that come out both from the US Congress and the White House?
I think there's a both and in that. I mean, if we zoom out to a global scale, it's important to recognize that 70% of the food that we eat as a globe is still grown by peasant farmers at a community level. So this small scale regenerative community-based agriculture feeds the majority of the world and often does so in ways that are much more ecologically sustainable than industrial agriculture. So we will continue to advocate for community-based solutions. During the pandemic, it was astounding to see how quickly industrial food systems crumbled in terms of supply chain disruptions, inability to process meat, empty grocery store shelves, whereas our local farms were able to pivot to online, get doorstep deliveries going and make sure that people were fed. At the same time, we really need to look at the way that the Farm Bill encourages these disparities by subsidizing commodity crops, which produce some of the least healthful food that get to our communities at cheap prices, by not supporting the specialty crops, the fruits and vegetables that make our communities healthy, by underfunding SNAP and school lunches, by pumping reservations full of commodity foods that are anti-health. And so there are absolutely structural and legislative changes that need to happen at the same time as our communities continue to increase our capacity to grow food and to feed ourselves.
And I know your mother was one of those very active people during the civil rights movement. She, in fact, marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King. When you consider that more than 50 years since his death, this is the state of America when it comes to racial equality. And if hunger is caused by poverty and injustice and racism, not a scarcity of food, can you really transform the existing systems to make sure that everyone has the right and the access they need to nutritious food? And can you reconcile the fact that millions of people in the wealthiest country in the world today are facing such food insecurity?
It's powerful that you bring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Into the space. And yes, my mother worked diligently on civil rights and women's rights. And I pray to honor her legacy through my work. Dr. King, shortly before his death, started speaking out about issues of agriculture and food, talking about how the subsidies in the United States were set up so that white farmers were paid essentially not to farm, whereas Black farmers were told to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And this really disparate allocation of resources leading to the structural inequities, which in turn lead to hunger and poverty. And so I think that we do need to ask ourselves really bold questions about why are we still here? Why have we gone backwards in some ways in the past 50 years? And to question the holy grail of racial capitalism. Is an economic system that is fundamentally designed to concentrate wealth in the hands of those who own capital really the best system to make sure that everyone has their basic needs met? And I think if we investigate that question, we'll see that there may be alternative economic systems that we need to consider if we truly want all people to be well.
Leah Penniman, such a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Now, while more than 40 million people in the US live in poverty, the number of people who are food insecure also accounts for over 10% of the population, with 1 in 6 children facing hunger. Poverty and a lack of access to resources have kept millions of Americans from having enough to eat, despite the US being the world's top food exporter. And the situation could get worse by the end of the summer, with higher prices on fuel, seeds, and fertilizer, as well as dry weather conditions and supply chain disruptions. Farmers are calling for financial assistance from the federal government to help them mitigate some of the increased costs. Yet, there is virtually no mention of this on campaign trails as Democrats and Republicans prepare for the midterms in November. The president of the Black Farmers Association put it simply when he said, quote, "Farming isn't Republican. It isn't Democrat. It isn't independent. It's food. Land is neutral." But food politics has become a daily reality in America, and it isn't neutral. Food policy and legislation involves every aspect of food production, control, regulation, and distribution. It also involves immigration policy. The majority of farm workers in the US are recent immigrants who lack basic legal protections. They're also at the forefront of the movement to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and the fight against labor exploitation. And so, in short, while the concept of food democracy may be gaining some traction, theoretically at least, safeguarding people's right and access to safe, nutritious food will take longer to achieve, as food companies continue to push up their profit margins and price increases, while more and more Americans find themselves struggling to feed themselves and make ends meet. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.